Pleasure to be here. My name's Chris Bennett. I've been a cannabis activist since about 1989, 1990. It's come a long way since then. Started out in Ucluelet out on Vancouver Island. What really got me interested was hemp for paper, because there was a big controversy going on then about logging the Clayoquot Sound. And I grew up logging, fishing, that type of stuff. So when people first started showing up and saying, oh, they're cutting all the trees down, it was like, what? What are you talking about? That's how people make a living. I wanted to find a balance between work and the environment, you know? And when I found out 1 acre of hemp could produce as much paper as 4 acres of trees over the same 20-year period, it was hard for me to enjoy the marijuana I grew in my back shed without saying something about the hemp for paper and then getting into this whole thing. And in that time, I've written a number of books on the history of cannabis, trying to figure out the roots of this whole plant and how far it goes back. And it goes really far back. You know, the term cannabis itself, the root word for it, canna, goes back to the oldest form of rootstock, even before Indo-European languages. So it's the oldest type of word that we have in language today. We can only speculate how man first came across this plant, probably in their search for food. They came across the nutritious seed, which is super rich in omega oils, one of the highest sources of essential fatty acids and most digestible sources of proteins known to man. And so probably when they were searching those buds for seeds, they got some of that sticky resin on their hands, you know what I mean? And maybe threw a bit of that on the fire and the smell rose up. As far as like industrial hemp fiber, we know that from tools used for breaking the fibers off of the hemp stalk, that goes back to about 28,000 years ago. And we have evidence of hemp cloth, 12,000 years old, 10,000 years old, from places like Catalhayak in Taiwan. And so those are pretty diverse cultures, and they already have these established processes for producing hemp. So we got to figure that they probably utilize the psychoactive properties equally early. The oldest evidence we have of burning cannabis goes back to about 5,500 years from the Ukraine region, where they found polypod bowls from these pictures here that were used to burn cannabis in a cave that held the fumes in where people could capture them, because they didn't have pipes and joints and things like that. Dr. Jeffrey Guy and Charles McPartland of GW Pharmaceuticals, they've even written a paper speculating that cannabis may have played an important role in what's known as humanity's great leap forward, 25, 30,000 years ago, when we started discovering things like fire and the wheel and things like that. So it's pretty important, you know, the type of novel thinking that cannabis produces may have facilitated that evolutionary process, that social evolution. And certainly culture grew out of agriculture, and people like Carl Sagan and Terence McKenna and others have speculated that cannabis was our first agricultural crop. There's a lot of evidence to that case. So today I'm going to focus mostly on archaeological evidence, linguistic evidence, things like that. We're limited in archaeological evidence because plants just don't hold up, like stones and rocks and things like that, bones and things. You know, usually but with cannabis, there's surprisingly a lot, even because people burnt it. So sometimes it was carbonized, and that resulted in the types of finds like this, where they found carbonized seeds. This culture here that had these pots, they were known as the Shredeni Snog in the Proto-Indo-European culture. They were also the first people to domesticate the horse. And it's thought the domestication of the horse itself took place through the development of hemp ropes and fibers that were able to corral the horses and capture them and stuff like that. And due to this high mobility, their descendants, the Scythians, who were nomadic horse riders, spread the use of cannabis throughout much of the ancient world. And we can trace this through things like language and archaeology. It's believed sometime around 2000, 3000 BC that they stopped burning cannabis as much and then started preparing it in corded ware vessels like this. And the British archaeologist Andrew Sherratt wrote, the disappearance of ceramic braziers in Northern and Western Europe was followed by the appearance of prominent forms of pottery drinking vessels, corded ware beakers, and early bell beakers are ornamented with the impressions of twisted cord. If these are hemp fibers, then the decoration may indicate that their contents were connected with cannabis. So they believe that these types of things, they would symbolize their contents by pressing hemp cords in there, and that these were used to contain hemp beverages, and a number of archaeologists believe this. And the Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture states, as cannabis can also be drinked, i.e. served as a component in a drink, it is also suggested that the spread of cord, decorated pottery from the steppe westward may also have been a part of the same complex. So this is a really popular theory with anthropologists and archaeologists. And they based this on these type of vessels here, which we used to drink poppy. Poppy was a very important pain reliever in the ancient world. You know, to deal with pain in the ancient world was a miracle in itself. You know, pain is something people have always struggled with. And they would make the vessels that contained the poppy juice in the shape of the poppy itself. And this is the spread of this corded ware culture that they're talking about throughout the ancient world. So it was pretty widespread throughout all of Europe and stuff. And cannabis has been found at Celtic and Druidic sites as well in Europe. So they found it in burial sites all over Europe, Germany, France, all over Europe. And as the authors of the exhaustive Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture have noted, there are at least 3 chronological horizons to which the spread of hemp might be ascribed. The early distribution of hemp across Europe during the Neolithic, 5000 BC or earlier. A later spread of hemp for presumably narcotic purposes, 3000 BC. And a still later spread, or at least reemergence of hemp in the context of textiles during the first millennium BC. So that means pretty much all of our ancestors, everybody in this room, from the looks of the people in here, had some sort of contact with this plant, whether they're ingesting it for psychoactive purposes or utilizing the fibers for dressing themselves or ingesting the very nutritious hemp seed. The descendants of the Sardini stock, as I mentioned earlier, are known as the Scythians, and the Scythians are a really interesting culture. You know, I'm using this blanket term for Scythian, but this really covers all sorts of Indo-European tribes that were interconnected. And they wore full body tattoos, had a gay priesthood, men and women shared equal rights. And we know about their cannabis use because Herodotus, a Greek historian, wrote about it. And Herodotus wrote that after the Scythian burials were completed, the Scyths would clean themselves in the following manner. They set up 3 sticks leaning together, which they cover with woolen felts. And in the circular shelter created as best they can, they put stones heated in a fire into a vessel set within the shelter. In Scythia they grow hemp, and the Scyths take some of its seeds, creep under the felt, and scatter the seeds over the hot stones, which gives off a great cloud of steam, a greater cloud of steam than any Greek steam bath. The Scyths, delighted by the steam, are loudly exultant. Well, what Herodotus is talking about is actually seeded buds. We know this because the Russian archaeologist Sergio Rudenko dug up material proof of Herodotus' claims in the 1940s in his excavation of a Scythian tomb of a Scythian warrior king. And accompanying to him in the afterlife, along with gold, horses, and other artifacts, was all the paraphernalia for the uses of cannabis into the afterlife. So this is a depiction of Scythians here partaking of cannabis in one of their ritual tents. And those are depictions of the types of braziers that they would use. They would heat the rocks up in a fire, then they would place the heated rocks inside these braziers, and they would throw the cannabis on top of the heated rocks. So it was kind of like the vaporizer from 2500 BC. And this is a sample of, you know, they found these types of, after Rudenko's find in the 1940s, they found numbers of finds, similar finds at other Scythian tombs. And this is an example of another find at a Scythian tomb with the rocks and the cannabis that was in it burnt. And this is the stuff that Rudenko found. So they would, this tent here was probably about this tall. They would cover that in a carpet, and they would put the brazier inside, and they'd just stick their head in and inhale the fumes. And they've also found a horn cup that contained cannabis residues and a leather flask that contained cannabis to show they were drinking cannabis as well. And more recently, here's a tattooed Scythian warrior. This is off of one of the Scythian king I mentioned earlier. This guy was actually like 65 when he died. He was about 6'3", died in battle. So he was still, you know, heading out into the battlefield at 65. You know, they're very healthy, vibrant people. Now, these gold bowls here were found recently at a Scythian tomb in the last few years, and they scraped them, and they found that the residues showed evidence of both cannabis and opium. And it's the archaeologists believe, Anton Gass, the Russian archaeologist involved, says these were used for drinking hayoma. And this is the Persian counterpart of the famous Soma beverage of ancient India, which was a pivotal drink in both India and Persia, known as hayoma. It's written about in the Persian Avesta, and known as Soma. It's written in the Vedic religion, in the Vedas as well. And it was a very powerful psychoactive sacrament. A lot of people have speculated that was the Amanita muscaria mushroom, but recent archaeological evidence like this is showing that it was actually probably a cannabis preparation. And because of the Scythian spread of cannabis, commonalities in language occurred. So in French, and this is this AN, their word was canna, and the AN in that appears in other cannabis-related words. In France, it's chambre with that AN. In English, cannabis. In Sanskrit, bong, it's got that AN. In Persian, bonga. In German, hanf. And other related dialects rooted in Indo-European words all take their AN sound from the name of cannabis from the Indo-European root canna. This use even spread into China, although it may have been here that cannabis picked up a new name that was also spread throughout the ancient world. The name for cannabis in China is huma. And this is Shen Nun. He is supposed to be the author of the Pen Tissau, which is thought by some to have been as old as 2700 BC, one of the first pharmacopoeias. And he recommended cannabis for a variety of ailments, similar to the ailments that people are prescribing medical marijuana for now. And there he is chewing his favorite plant. He was supposed to have the magical power of being able to look into his stomach to witness the activity of plants and how they worked on the system. And cannabis was very popular with the Taoists in ancient China. It was a major player in the formation of Taoist religion. And there's an ancient quatrain from China from about 2,500 years ago. First a yin, then a yang. No one knows what I do. Jade buds of holy hemp for the one that lives apart. It's kind of like life has its ups and downs, but with cannabis we're able to kind of take that middle road and, of detachment in a sense and kind of carry on, you know. Now, there's been a really fascinating discovery in China, and they found evidence of cannabis from 2,700 years ago. And it was perfectly preserved because of the cold climate and desert-like climate that was in. And this is a depiction of one of the mummies. They found it in a couple of different sites, but this is a depiction of one of the mummies. We can see the mummy there. And on the lower side there, there's a bowl, a basket that had about 2 pounds of female cannabis. There's a cannabis seed from the cannabis they found. And then there's a bowl there that the person who was buried there used for grinding cannabis. And here's a closer up of the basket and bowl that contained cannabis. And this is a close-up of the actual cannabis that they found. It was still green, still had resin glands on it and stuff. They tried to sprout the seeds, but unfortunately after 2,700 years they weren't sprouting. And this is a depiction of the shaman that was found with the cannabis. And he was obviously a very important person in the group that he existed with of high importance. They took a lot of effort to bury him properly and supply him with all the things he needed for his afterlife. And so they were probably using it both medically and for shamanic purposes as well. Now, what's interesting about this culture is they're called the Gushi culture. They're actually Indo-European Caucasian people that were living in China from about 2000 BC up until about 400 BC, when the indigenous Chinese, the Han Chinese, are thought to have chased them out. And it seems that after that time there was sort of a prejudice in China against cannabis because of the association with these foreigners, even though they lived there for quite a long time. But they were involved with a major amount of trade. They've done DNA tests like this, and the people living there had DNA from Eastern and Western Europe, from Asia. This mummy had cowrie shells on his hat from India. And it's changed the way we think about history and the connectivity of cultures in ancient history. They thought before this discovery that the Silk Road had been started probably about a few hundred years BC. Now it's thought to go back a couple thousand years BC because of the discovery of this culture and the evidence of trade. And it may have been here that the Chinese name Huma was first adopted into the Indo-European language as Heoma, because this culture was in contact with other cultures, such as the BMAC culture, Bacteria Margiana Archaeological Complex, which is out in the outer regions of Afghanistan. And in the BMAC region, Bacteria Margiana Archaeological Complex, they found evidence of 3 huge temples. And this temple here is about the size of a football field. Half of that temple was dedicated to making the sacred beverage, the Heoma. And they found residues of both cannabis, ephedra, and poppy there, as well as impressions of cannabis seeds. And it's interesting because ephedra is still used in the modern Heoma preparation. And this is Victor Sarianati, the Russian archaeologist who discovered this ancient site. Here's a depiction of the site itself. Another close-up of the temple rebuilt from depictions there. And this is where they would grind the soma. So what they would do is they had big mortars and pestles, and they would grind the cannabis in these sites here. And this is where they tested the stuff at the bottom there, which was hardened residue from the ancient time period, and it showed evidence of both cannabis ephedra and poppy. And this is fossilized impressions of cannabis seeds that were found at the site as well. And then this is the tools and things like that that were found at the site. On the left-hand side there, those middle little pipes there, they showed evidence of opium residue. They were bone cups, and they have eyes on them, likely indicating the visionary state that the opium would produce. And then below that is a vessel that was used for filtering the cannabis beverage. They would it would be mixed with milk and ground up, and then they would pour it through that, and then with a wool filter it would take out all the plant matter, and there'd be a drink below that. And they still prepare cannabis like this in India today. It's known as bhang. And this is Lord Shiva, the oldest continually worshipped god on earth, whose sacred plant is cannabis, preparing cannabis by grinding it with a rock on a flat rock and preparing the drink bhang. And this is a picture of Islamic fakirs and Sufis, and they're also preparing cannabis. In the center there's a similar vessel there for straining the cannabis, and the guys in the lower left-hand corner are breaking cannabis off the plant, and everybody else is preparing it. The guys in the upper right-hand, my right, I guess, corner there are grinding it and preparing it as well. So this is like a 18th century painting of Sufis, dervishes preparing cannabis in the same way that it would have been done at this ancient temple site 4,000 years before. And this is a depiction from an article in the 19th century called Orgies of the Hemp Eaters, and it's accounting of a cannabis ritual taking place. And in the 19th century in Syria, they were still taking cannabis and consuming it as heoma. So that makes it a stronger connection with the ancient world. You know, we're talking about a continuous tradition of at least 4,000 years. Now Zoroaster is a major figure in the reforms that took place in the religion that was using heoma, which was called Mazdaism. And he is thought by some to have stopped the heoma rituals, but there's interesting references to cannabis that continue on in the Zoroastrian religion. And it's known as Zoroaster's good narcotic in the ancient texts of Zoroastrianism. And in quest and visionary journeys in Sasanian Iran, Saul Shockhead notes that the use of cannabis for visionary quest was not a way open for all. It was confined to select individuals who would have regarded themselves as representatives of the community and who would then reveal to the others what they had been privileged to witness. Even for those people, this was not a trivial experience that could be undertaken casually or easily repeated. Such journeys were rare occasions surrounded by grave risks. The danger lay in the very fact that this was the path trodden by the dead and would have to be brought back to life. Certain encounters along the way may put the power of endurance of the traveler to the test. So they would take so much cannabis extract prepared into wine that it would literally knock them out for a couple of days. And after this, they'd wake up and they'd say, oh, well, I had this vision, you know what I mean? And that's like a common theme in the ancient world, is the use of psychoactive substances, and people interpret that as some sort of actual experience, much like Dreamtime with the Australian Aborigines, where they say that that's a reality, not just a dream, not just something that's taking place in your head. When people had visions on psychoactive substances in the ancient world, much like people in South America and Africa still do today, they interpreted those as actual spiritual experiences where the soul left the body and went to another place and experienced it. They didn't have a concept of drugs affecting the brain receptors and things like that. And this is Zoroaster turning on his first devotee, King Vishtaspa, who was a major figure in the acceptance of Zoroastrianism as the main religion of Persia, and he did so after partaking of cannabis. And this is a vision of Ardu Viraf, a Zoroastrian hero who was said to have drank the cannabis and then gone on to see both heaven and hell, and this later filtered into Judaism and Christianity. And as Geraldo Noli recorded in Encyclopedia Iranica, bhang was an ingredient of the illuminating drink that allowed Vishtaspa to see the great mystery. The bhang of Vishtaspa was mixed with wine and was an integral part of the ecstatic practice aimed at opening the eye of the soul. And from the
Zoroastrian religion, it filtered into the Indian religion as well. And Buddha was said to have partaken of 1 hemp seed a day for the period while he was under the Bodhi tree in meditation. And after that, announced his revelations. And here he is, I guess, on the 1 hemp seed a day diet. And this is Mahakala, who's a Tibetan Buddhist version of Shiva. The use of hemp was spread into India via the Vedas, and descriptions of the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda describe the soma as green and purple, and branches of soma were beaten with a rock, are comparable to later preparations of ban with a mortar and pestle. The view that soma was cannabis has been held by a variety of Indian authors, most prominently by Chandra Chakrabarti, who made this association clear in a number of different books. Soma was made with the flowering tops and resins of cannabis sativa, which is the aphrodisiac and stimulant and a nourishing food. Of all the plants, soma is the king. It is safe to conclude that soma is cannabis. And Joseph Chandra Ray noted in the soma plant in 1939, the effects of soma drunk are exactly the same as those of bhang. Soma used to be drunk between eating of food. It is nourishing when taken with milk and food. It is exhilarating. It excites and is intoxicating. It stimulates the voice and impels the flow of words. It awakens eager thought. It excites poetic imagination. It induces sleep and desire for women. It bestows fertility. It cures diseases and was believed to prolong life. None but the strong can tolerate it. It was drunk before military engagement and after victory, for which Indra's favor was prayed for. It was very difficult to acquire, and it was highly taxed because the soma came into India from another region. Cannabis isn't indigenous to India. It was actually imported originally. And because of these stringent taxes, it was very, very expensive, and it eventually became slightly prohibitive because of those taxes. Now, it's important to remember that Buddha, who I mentioned before, his use was not psychoactive. It was just the hemp seed. And it's thought that Buddha was a reformer of the Vedic religion, and things like alcohol, meat eating, and the use of soma were all prohibited under Buddhism. And in the 3rd century, the Indian text Lalita Vistra refers to Buddha's use of cannabis. The prince to the Gaya mountains reflected, considering that he is intended to penetrate the secret influences which actuate the conduct of men. He might, after 6 years, be in a position to save them. Thus he addressed himself to the practice of austerities, each day eating 1 grain of hemp, 1 grain of rice, by this means reducing himself to a condition of overcoming all pleasures. Afterwards, perceiving that this was not the true way, he pursued the contrary method, using indulgences, bathing, perfuming himself, and so on, and by these means he subdued sorrow. And then, even though it seems to have disappeared in early Buddhism, in later Tibetan Buddhism and stuff, it came back. And in their well-researched essay, Psychoactive Plants in Tantric Buddhism, Cannabis and Datura Use in Indo-Tibetan Esoteric Buddhism, researchers Parker and Lux identify references to cannabis, datura, and other psychoactive plants in medieval Buddhist tantric texts, such as the Mahakala Tantra, that's Mahakala there, where the plants are employed to attain health, wealth, wisdom, and supernatural powers, such as seeing underground and flying. Well, those are pretty powerful powers. And so cannabis didn't completely disappear in the Indian tradition either. And so there's a story, the churning of the ocean of milk. And the churning of the ocean of milk is a very important myth in Hinduism, and there's a festival based around it called the Kumbh Mela, which is the longest and largest continual gathering of humans on the planet. It happens about every 3 or 4 years in India at different sites, 3 or 4 different sites. And it's a massive gathering, and it's based on this myth of the churning of the ocean of milk. And in the story, Indra is riding along on his elephant. Indra was the king of the gods in the Vedic pantheon. And a guy offers him some flowers, and he just kind of brushes them off and insults him. And he didn't realize it, but it was an incarnation of Shiva. And he calls down a curse on the 3 worlds. And the gods are suffering, humanity's suffering, and they're like, oh no, what's happened? And so the gods gather and they go to talk to Brahma. And they say, Brahma, what's happened? And he says, oh, you need to go talk to Vishnu. And they talk to Vishnu. And Vishnu goes, oh, well, you know what's happened is the man you insulted was the creator of the universe, and you totally insulted him. So what you need to do is you need to get potent herbs and take them to the ocean of milk and stir them in there, and then you'll be able to produce amrita, which is the counterpart of soma. And this is a huge job, and in order to do this job, they have to go get a whole mountain to act as the pestle, and the ocean itself is going to be the mortar with the ocean of milk in it. And they throw the potent herbs in there, and then it's such a big job to churn it, they've got to convince the demons to help them as well. So they go, okay, you guys give it this, and we'll give you some of the amrita when we get it out. And so they get together, and they get this big snake, and they wrap it around the mountain, and they start churning the ocean of milk. And there they are again, they're churning it, you know. And a bit of the amrita spills out, and they decide, well, we don't really want the demons to get this after all. So they give it to this figure here, the Garuda, which is a bird man, and he grabs some of it in the cup here, and he flies off, and some of it spills on the ground. And where it spills, this is the site where the Kumbh Mela take place in India. And it's also the site where the cannabis plant is that's thought to have sprout from as well, because the amrita, which is the soma, dropped it onto the ground, and cannabis is the earthly counterpart of that majestic soma in the sky. And these are sadhus here that you see here, these long-haired men, worshippers of Shiva. Shiva was instrumental in the production of amrita and the soma. So they worship Shiva, and cannabis, they partake of it as a part of the body of Shiva, much like the Christian Eucharist. And in more modern times, they began smoking it. After the New World discovery of smoking, they smoke it in chillums, and they partake of it. And you can go to India today and partake of cannabis with these holy men. You can witness them along the Ganges River partaking cannabis before they sit down to do their yogic asanas. And here's Shiva himself, blue god, the oldest continually worshipped god on earth, preparing cannabis. He's grinding it in this pot here with a mortar and pestle, and the green beverage in front of him is the prepared cannabis. And here he is with his family. Here's his son Ganesh preparing cannabis down in the right-hand corner. His wife's passing him a bowl of the bong, and he's got his serpent there testing it out. And this is a marble statue of Shiva I have in my home. He's preparing cannabis, drinking cannabis, and smoking the chillum. And this is a sadhu in India, smoking the chillum. And there's Lord Shiva up in the Himalayas, partaking of cannabis before sitting down to meditation. This is an 18th century painting of Shiva sadhus partaking of the chillum. And this is Kali Ma. Cannabis is used in tantric rituals to Kali, where it's known as Vajaje, victory, and is used in tantric sex rites and things like that. As G.A. Grierson noted in 1894 in The Hemp Plant in Sanskrit and Hindi literature, Bang was originally produced like nectar from the ocean by the churning with Mount Mandara, and inasmuch as it gives victory in the three worlds, it is the delight of the king of the gods. It is called Vajaje, victory, the victorious. This desire-fulfilling drug was obtained by men on earth through the desire of welfare for all people. And as Joseph Campbell noted in his 1894 essay on the religion of hemp, according to one account, when nectar was produced from the churning of the ocean, something was wanted to purify the nectar. The deity supplied the want of a nectar cleanser by creating bong. This bong, Mahadev Shiva made from his own body, and so it is called body-born. According to another account, some nectar dropped to the ground, and from the ground the bong plant sprang. It was because they used this child of nectar, or of Mahadev, in agreement of religious forms, that the seers or rishis became siddha, or one with Shiva. He who, despite the example of the rishis, uses no bong shall lose his happiness in this life and in the life to come. In the end he shall be cast into hell. The mere sight of bong cleanses from as much sin as 1,000 horse sacrifices or 1,000 pilgrimages. He who scandalizes the user of bong shall suffer the torments of hell so long as the sun endures. He who drinks bong foolishly or for pleasure without religious rites is as guilty as the sinner of sins. He who drinks wisely and according to rule, be he ever so low, even though his body is smeared with human or urine, is Shiva. No god or man is as good as the religious drinker of bong. The students of the scriptures at Benares are given bong before they sit to study. At Benares, Ujjain, and other holy places, the yogis and sadhus take deep draughts of bong because that they might center their thoughts on the eternal. The Hindu poet of Shiva, the great spirit that living in bong passes into the drinker, sings of bong as the clearer of ignorance, the giver of knowledge. No gem or jewel can touch and value bong taken truly and reverently. He who drinks bhang drinks Shiva. The soul in whom the spirit of bhang finds a home glides into the ocean of being, freed from the weary round of matter-blinded self. So that's what they were thinking about cannabis in India over a century ago. And in sadhus, India's mystic holy man, Dove Hartsucker, explains more about Shiva's special relationship with cannabis and the development of smoking it. The smoking of charas, cannabis, is regarded as a sacred act. Intoxication, as a respected method of self-realization, is related to soma, the nectar of the gods, which is recommended in the Vedas as a sure means of attaining divine wisdom. Mythologically, charas is intimately connected with Shiva. He smokes it. He is perpetually intoxicated by it. He is the Lord of charas. Babas offers the smoke to him. They want to take part in his ecstasy, his higher vision of reality. And this is the Festival of Colors, a harvest festival in India where everybody throws paint and colored powder on themselves in this great, and everybody's drunk on bhang, whole families, everybody's drunk on this bhang stuff. So this is a very famous cannabis holiday, and there's all sorts of bhang sellers at these things and stuff. So this is a major, if we want to know what legal cannabis looks like, we could go to India and see the continuum of cannabis culture going back from the ancient world into the modern, where there's bhang sellers and hash sellers and things like that. And this is the Jagannath Festival, another festival in India. And in the Jagannath Festival, which involves the marriage of the god and the goddess in order to bring on the monsoon season, cannabis is ritually ingested in that as well. And then these are Sikh Nihangs. The Nihangs are a branch of the Sikh religion that are the warrior protectors of the sacred sites. And they partake of cannabis as sukkadun. Their sacrament is sukkadun. And they prepare it in the same way. See their massive mortar and pestle there? This guy's preparing cannabis with his massive mortar and pestle. And here they are again with their massive mortars and pestles. They prepare cannabis at these huge festivals. The Nihangs are really interesting because they wouldn't bow down to the British overlords during the British Raj. And the British found them really hard to deal with. They were riding around on their horses, armed to the teeth, constantly intoxicated with cannabis, total rebels. Here they are again preparing their bhang for their rituals. Okay, and this brings us into Assyrian use. From accounts, it is quite clear that the oil, fiber, medical, and spiritual qualities of hemp were well known in ancient Mesopotamia. In regards to medical applications, numbers of medical applications of cannabis, along with other plant components, are prescribed in the Asian Assyrian cuneiform tablets. Things such as epilepsy, known as hand of ghost, an aid in childbirth, depression of the spirits. If he eats a plant, he will have no sorrows. Cannabis was used in oil to anoint swelling, and it was also employed as a simple poultice. It was often employed in Mesopotamia to relieve the pain of bronchitis, bladder trouble, rheumatism, and as a remedy for insomnia. In regards to spiritual use, a 4,000-year-old inscription in the temple documents of the 3rd dynasty of Ur has an inscribed memoranda of 3 regular offerings of hemp. And in a letter written in 680 BC to the mother of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, who's depicted here, reference is made to Kanabu, which is the Assyrian name for cannabis. And in response to Esarhaddon's mother's question as to what is used in the sacred rites, a high priest responds that the main items for the rites are fine oil, water, honey, odorous plants, and hemp. So here we can see King Esarhaddon here, and he's heading over to like a little incense tent there where they can kind of capture the fumes, much like the Scythian tents we described earlier, but much more elaborate. And cannabis was particularly dedicated to the god Enki, who's thought to have been the prototype for the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and the goddess Ishtar, and it was considered Ishtar's sacred aromatic. And this is Ashurbanipal. And the oldest references we have to hashish occur in his cuneiform library, recipes for hashish. Ashurbanipal and Esarhaddon appear in the Old Testament. And it's interesting because there's a very popular theory, something that a lot of people know through my work as well, that there's this idea that there's this Hebrew word, cannabosum, that actually makes reference to cannabis that was mistranslated as calamus when they translated the ancient Hebrew text into Greek and then Latin. Became calamus. And this goes back to a Polish etymologist and anthropologist known as Sula Bennett, who began writing about this in 1936 and wrote about it for a number of decades afterwards. And she says this Hebrew term cannabosum, as I said, was mistranslated, but by tracking the modern term cannabis back through history in the Hebrew language, where the Mishnah period was known as Cannabis, as well as comparing it to the similar Assyrian term Cannabu. You can show that this was a reference to cannabis. Also, the similar ways that they used it. Now, it's interesting because Moses first meets the angel of the Lord in the flames of fire from within a burning bush, which is kind of ironic considering all this. And this is a page from the Living Torah by Rabbi Ari Kaplan, and he's talking about these Hebrew references here and saying that due to cognate pronunciations, that some people are saying that this is a reference to cannabis. But it's much more than just cognate pronunciations. So in the first of these references, God commands Moses, who first appeared to Moses in flames of fire from within a burning bush. The burning bush commands him to make a holy anointing oil with about 6 pounds of this cannabis mixed with myrrh and cinnamon, put into about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And every time that Moses is to speak to the Lord, he's to place some of this oil on his body, and THC is fatty soluble, and your skin's a big organ. And then he would also take some of this oil and he would place it on the altar of incense. And then he would speak to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense. And so when you throw a psychoactive substance like cannabis into that tent with Moses, that tent of the meeting, which is kind of like the Scythian tents, meant to enclose and hold the smoke, it kind of changes the whole scenario. Moses becomes like a shaman, who, like shamans in South America and Africa and other places, interpret the effects they get from psychoactive plants like iboga or ayahuasca as actual messages from the spirit. And here we see the anointing oil being poured on a devotee's head, and then putting the oil on the altar of incense. And there they are speaking to the angel of the Lord over the altar of incense. Now, the term cannabis is thought to have come into the Hebrew language. And this is the Hebrew counterpart of this Indo-European term canna. And it's described as an item of trade. In Jeremiah, they refer to canna from a distant land. And in Ezekiel, they say Danites and Greeks from Uzal brought you merchandise. They exchanged wrought iron, cassa, and canna for your wares. So when an item came in from somewhere else and was introduced, usually it kept that same name that it was introduced with, and that's the case with cannabis. And as Paul Johnson noted in A History of the Jews, prophets practiced ecstasy states and may have used incenses and narcotics to produce impressive effects. The Israelite prophets acted as mediums in a state of trance or frenzy. They related their divine visions in a sing-song chant, at times as a scream. These states could be induced by music, but the prophets also used, and sometimes abused, incense, narcotics, and alcohol. And so what they would do in both Assyria and throughout the Mideast, this was common practice in these ancient temples, is they would create this temple atmosphere by having people in costumes, winged costumes, and statues, and then the lighting would be produced by firelight, candlelights, and it would be smoke everywhere. It would make it look like even the statues were moving because of the atmosphere. And then they would kind of get a drum beat going and a kind of repetitive music, and that would throw people into trance. And then the prophets would kind of get into that, and kind of like a rapper listening to a beat, they'd start kind of getting to kind of generate something, and then the ideas would start flowing out. And much of our religious texts, the Vedas, the Avesta, big parts of the Bible, were all written in verse and song, because that's how they were delivered. And this shamanic state was induced by the use of cannabis and other entheogens, and so it kind of tapped into this creative aspect. And the Assyrian references are particularly important in understanding the Hebraic use, as there's not only the phonetic similarity between the terms Cannabu and Cannabis, but also they identify the temple-based oracular use of the substance in question. In both cases, it was used for the same purpose. And in both cases, there's references to it as an incense, ingested, and as well as a topical. And in this respect, it should be noted that in Assyrian references, cannabis was used not only as an incense in ingested forms, but in topical lotions as well. An Assyrian medical tablet from the Louvre collection has been translated, so that God of man and man should be in good rapport with hellebore, cannabis, and lupine, you will rub them. So we have the identical use of a topical cannabis preparation in the same time period in the Old Testament. So it seems pretty powerful that that's the case. And there we see again, they're at the burning temple in the incense, and the angel of the Lord appears. The next reference to cannabis in the Old Testament, according to Sula Bennett, takes place in the Song of Songs. And it says, your plants are an orchard of pomegranates with choice fruits, with henna and nard and saffron, canna and cinnamon, with every kind of incense tree. And the Song of Songs is an important text in the Bible, because what it describes is what is known as the Hieros Gamos, or the sacred marriage. And this was a ritual that took place throughout the whole ancient Mideast, where the marriage of the god and the god was God and the goddess was taking place on earth with earthly counterparts, and was mimicked, and was thought to create some sort of divine communion between earth and heaven by mimicking the acts of the god and the goddess on the earthly realm. And cannabis seems to have been widely used in these sacred marriages. And in ancient Canaan and in ancient Israel, there was a goddess actually for a long time we know about now because of cuneiform tablets that refer to her, and ancient inscriptions, and that even refer to Yahweh's wife, Asherah. Yahweh and his Asherah, and this was his goddess Asherah. And her cult was particularly involved with cannabis as well. And she is thought to be the Canaanite counterpart of Ishtar. And that's Asherah there, feeding some goats with some budding type plants. And this is Asherah, an ancient goddess that Ishtar and Asherah and other goddesses are thought to have developed from. And we know that her cult was using cannabis because there's ancient inscriptions that refer directly to cannabis in her cult. And the next reference appears in Isaiah. Isaiah's got this really interesting quote here. It says, you have not brought any canna for me, or lavished on me the fat of your sacrifices, but you have burdened me with your sins and wearied me with your offenses. So what's happening now is, like, where's the canna? You know, at this time in Israel, it's polytheistic, and we even know about the polytheistic means there's all sorts of gods and goddesses in the pantheon, not monotheism, where there's just one god, which happened in later Judaism. We know about this because it's written about in the Bible itself. It's referring to kings and queens and everything like that, worshiping other gods, and how terrible this is numbers of times throughout the Old Testament. And what's happened is cannabis was popular at all of these temple sites, because when they brought cannabis, the gods were more prone to talk. And when it wasn't around, the gods were a little quieter for some reason. I don't know why, but you know. And so luckily for Isaiah, there wasn't always this shortage of cannabis, because we have this other verse. And the post of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hands, which he had taken with tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth and said, lo, this has touched thy lips, and thy iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. And so here we can see the seraphim, who's done, you know, artfully as an angel here, but probably represented a priest of the temple. He's taken with tongs a coal from the altar of incense, and he's held it right up to Isaiah's lips so that he can have a super hit. Kind of like the old hot knives, you know. And there's another depiction of Isaiah taking his toke from the burning coal from off the altar. And this is like an Assyrian depiction that's often depicted in the Assyrian sacred rites, which we know cannabis was in use at as well. And it likely depicts, you know, probably a shaman, much like Native American shamans, wearing a mask and wing costume and stuff, you know. It's part of the ritual. And so that's kind of like what was taking place. You know, and it's ironic, considering some of this, the way that Bible believers have treated some of these indigenous cultures that have used these psychoactive plants and practiced things like shamanism, where it's been treated like witchcraft. And somehow the miracles of the Bible, the visions of Ezekiel are real, but what these people are practicing is somehow heathen and to be done away with and to be suppressed. Now, we can start to see cannabis fall out of flavor with the Hebrews in these references in the Old Testament. And in the books of Jeremiah, we read, what do I care about incense from Sheba or canna from a distant land? Your burnt offerings are not acceptable. Your sacrifices do not please me. So it's been totally rejected. Well, what's happened here? Why was it before something celebrated as part of the temple life, an important ingredient in the sacred holy anointing oil and incenses, but now it's rejected? Well, what's happened is is the Hebrew religion itself has gone from this nomadic kind of shamanic religion into this big, huge kingdom. And at this point in time in history, they're finding themselves attacked by bigger foreign kingdoms like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and people like that. And polytheism, you got to remember that religious groups back in those days, there was no separation of church and state, and all these different religious groups were like competing political groups as well. And the Hebrews' drive for monotheism was a way of actually consolidating power. And so they suppressed all these other religions, and Jeremiah was a big player in that suppression. And you can see this in Jeremiah 44, where Jeremiah gathers in front of some Hebrews who escaped to Egypt, you know, and he's trying to convince them to go back and protect their own holy land. And he says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, ye have seen all the evil that I have brought upon Jerusalem and upon all the cities of Judah, and behold, this day they are a desolation." So he's saying that the destruction of Israel and Judah is actually God's will, punishing them for their wicked ways. Because of their wickedness, which they have committed to provoke me to anger, and that they wanted to burn incense and to serve other gods. Therefore now, wherefore commit ye this great evil against your souls, and that ye provoke me to wrath with the works of your hands, burning incense unto other gods in the land of Egypt? Then all the men which knew that their wives had burned incense unto other gods, and all the women that stood by, a great multitude, even all the people that dwelt in the land of Egypt, answered Jeremiah, saying, "And for the word that thou hast spoken unto us in the name of the Lord, we will not hearken unto thee, but we will certainly do whatsoever thing goeth forth out of our own mouths, to burn incense unto the Queen of heaven, and to pour drink offerings unto her, as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings and our princes in the city of Judah, and the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of victuals, and were well, and saw no evil." So they're saying back in the days when they used to worship the god and the goddess beside each other, like Solomon and stuff like that, things were actually pretty good. It wasn't until they brought all this monotheism in and started all these prohibition and stuff like that, the trouble started. And then this brings us to Ezra and the cup of fire. Ezra is a really important figure in the writing of the Old Testament. He was actually in Persia under the Persians, and they sent him back over to Israel to kind of, he was going to act as kind of the intermediary between Israel and Persia. And this was where monotheism really comes into place. And Ezra gathered all the different books that make up the Old Testament and put them together in their present state, wove them all together, contradicting texts and whatnot from different groups and different time periods. And here is Ezra's own account of the process of making Jewish history. After telling the people not to seek him for 40 days and taking with them 5 persons whom he names, who could write swiftly, they retired to a field where they remained. The next day, behold, a voice cried to me, saying, "Ezra, open thy mouth and drink what I give thee to drink." Then I opened my mouth, and behold, he reached me a full cup, which is full, as it were, with water, but the color of it was like fire. I took it and I drank, and when I had drunk of it, my heart uttered understanding, and wisdom grew in my breast, for my spirit strengthened in my memory, and my mouth was open and shut no more. And they sat 40 days, and they wrote in the day and the night as they ate bread. As for me, I spake by the day, and I held not my tongue by the night. In 40 days, they wrote 204 books. So Ezra is saying that he took the substance that he was given to drink, he drank it, then he started kind of prophesizing, and the other people wrote it down. And George Brown, writing in the 19th century, wrote about this. He said, "A voice bid him to open his mouth. He, the voice, of course, reached Ezra's a full cup. It would be interesting to know whose voice it was which possessed such unnatural powers. Yet we apprehend the reader is much more anxious to know the contents of the cup, which was fiery red, and which possessed such wondrous ability, probably the same possessed by the fruit of the tree which grew in the midst of the garden, and eating of which opened the eyes of our first parents, and enabled them to see as gods, knowing good and evil. We think we can furnish this desired information, to do which we are compelled to anticipate some facts existing among Zoroastrian worshippers. Many centuries before the date religion is ascribed to Abraham, and which was practiced in Persia, Assyria, and Babylonia, at the very time Ezra was writing Jewish history under the influence of the fiery cup. Among other duties required on occasional sacrifices of animals to Ahura Mazda, additional to prayers, praises, thanksgiving, and the recitation of hymns, was the performance from time to time of a curious ceremony known as that of the Heoma. This consisted of the extraction of the juice of Haoma plant by the priest during the recitation of prayers, the formal presentation of the liquid extracted to the sacrificial fire, the consumption of a small portion of it by one of the officiating ministers, and the division of the remainder among the worshippers. What was Haoma or Homa? The production of the moon plant growing in those regions of Asia as far north, too far north for the successful growing of the grape, and yet yielding such intoxicating properties? It is known as, in the medical books, as cannabis, and belongs to the Indian hemp family, Cannabis indica being an official preparation from it. It is now known in India as bhang and is popularly known with us as hashish, the stimulating and intoxicating effects which are well known to physicians. The extract from its young and tender top has a fragrant odor and a warm, bitterish, acritic taste. So basically, a century ago, this guy was saying that this reference in Ezra, who was a vassal of the Persian state, Persians drank this cannabis preparation we know from the Persian holy books, was drinking the same preparation in Israel for his inspiration in putting the Old Testament together. And it's interesting because this guy here, Professor Vicente Dubraca, totally independently, no knowledge of Brown's work whatsoever, came up with this exact same idea. And in his article, Preparations for Visions in Second Temple Jewish Apocalyptic Literature, Dubraca also noted a comparison between the Persian technique of shamanic ecstasy and that of Ezra. And on the next day, behold, a voice called me, saying, Ezra, open your mouth and drink what I give you to drink. Then I opened my mouth, and behold, a full cup was offered to me. It was full of something like water, but its color was like fire, and I took it and drank. Similar drinks appear in Persian literature. In the Bahaman Yesh, when Zoroaster drinks the water, he acquires the wisdom of Ahura Mazda. Similarly, Vishtaspa has an experience quite equivalent and mentions a mixture of wine and hemp. Opposition to those practices may have generated their replacement in later books. The book of R2 Vira also mentions visions obtained by the wine mixed with hemp and for the preparation of the seer. So they're talking about the same sort of things I was mentioning earlier with the Zoroastrian religion, how it developed out of the drink of the Haoma. And here it is. Scholars on ancient Judaism are saying that this was used by the Jews as well. Dubraca revisited this theme in more detail in his later 2006 article, Chemically Induced Visions in the Fourth Book of Ezra, in light of comparative Persian material. And again draws direct comparison between Ezra's cup of fire and the bhang-infused beverages of the Zoroastrian psychonauts. And so, since then, we found fossilized remains of cannabis in the Holy Land. This is a fossilized piece of cannabis found in Bet Shemesh in Jerusalem. It was found at a tomb of a girl who died of childbirth. They've been using it as medicine in childbirth, both applying it topically on her stomach, as well as burning it as an incense in the site. And it shows that cannabis had been continually used in that area for some thousands of years, you know. And so, you know, when we're talking about cannabis and our relationship with cannabis, you know, it's really a natural right, sort of like a right to the warmth of the sun or the fresh water of a river. You know, it's like a natural right. It's like a right to the plants of the earth. And we're talking about a plant that humanity has had a relationship with, not for a short time, not since the Jazz Age when reefer madness was taking place, not since the 60s, since the hippies were taking place, but before any books were written, before any religion existed, before any of that. You know, it's probably our first medicine. It's in the oldest pharmacopoeias, the Pentasau, the Ayurvedic medicine, in these Assyrian texts and Egyptian texts, all over, widespread already, thousands and thousands of years ago. And we have a natural relationship with this plant. And this is a natural right. We shouldn't have to ask anybody for it, but we find ourselves persecuted and having to explain ourselves. But this is Earth's medicine, and this medicine's time is now. And with it, we can save our forests. We can move away from cutting down our trees for paper. We can make building material out of it. We can move away from fossil fuels by using biomass hemp fuels and make plastics and all sorts of things out of it. You can make batteries out of cannabis. It's just such an incredible plant. We can move away from soil-depleting cotton. 50% of the chemicals and pesticides used in agriculture are used on cotton. That's what caused the Great Depression. Turned soil into a dust bowl. Cannabis actually enriches the soil. It can be cross-cropped with other crops, so you keep the soil healthy by cross-cropping. And we can use it to heal our bodies. You know, things like epilepsy, that was thought to be demonic possession up until medieval times. So it was like a miracle to those people that discovered it, when they could stop the shaking of that person and relieve it of what they thought was a demon. You know, it was like a full-on miracle. And they were using it for the same sorts of medical reasons that we're using it for. We're only rediscovering the medical qualities of cannabis. It's the oldest medicine. And it's probably the first religious sacrament as well. We can see from these references here just how far it goes back. So good work you're all doing here. I'm glad you all showed up today. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.